I'm Lloyd Holliday, and this is the Cost of a Thing podcast. Thanks for listening in today. The cost of a thing is the amount of time that you must spend working to buy the things that you want and need. And that directly determines your standard of living. And the American standard of living is what this podcast is all about. And I'm going to be discussing anything that affects that standard of living, especially those things that affect it negatively. And especially those things that have lowered our standard of living from the one that we had in America here in the 1960s, which was better than the one today. And why am I doing this, talking about our standard of living? Because I've been there when it was better than it is now. I've seen how it was in the 1960s and 70s, and it was better in general for more people. And I don't see the government talking about this, trying to improve the standard of living. I don't see the media talking about this. It's either ignored or it's forgotten, and it may be purposely ignored. So that's why I want to bring these things out. I want to bring attention to the fact that our standard of living has gone down and is going down, and that's what I'm going to talk about right here on the Cost of a Thing podcasts. So what happened to that great standard of living that we had in the 1960s and 1970s? Generally, during that time, you'd get out of high school, you'd get a good job in a factory with good pay, good benefits, pension, vacation, job security, those kind of things. And you could start a household and raise a family on that job's income. And most of the time, the wife didn't have to work. It was very common for mom to stay home and take care of the household and raise the kids and that kind of thing. Didn't have to work outside the house unless she wanted to. The average house cost 2 to 3 times annual income. Very affordable. Nice home, nice area. The job paid full medical benefits most of the time. College was inexpensive. You could work during the summer and make enough money to pay your tuition and living expenses during the school year. Well, it was a great life. It was a great economic miracle. The middle class was growing. It was huge. Even the lower income people were doing better then, because rent and housing didn't cost that much, so they could still afford a nice place to live a lot of times. So during that time, generally, people lived better than they're living now. Generally, more people lived better during that time than they do now. So what happened? Since then, worker productivity is up about 4 times. A worker produces about 4 times what he did back in those days. And yet, today, the standard of living is down, lower than it was in the 1960s. People today are working harder than they did then and getting less for it. And that doesn't make sense. If worker productivity is up 4 times, why are the workers getting less than they got back then? They should be getting 4 times as much. Well, I lived back in the 1960s. I grew up in the 1960s, and I lived through the 70s, and it was great. It was a great time to live. And I bet most people in that age group, the boomers as they call our generation, would agree with me. And they lived through it. They saw what was happening then, and they see what's happening now. I doubt very many people are going to say, yeah, it's much better now than it was then. No, it's not. Uh, well, so why is it that the standard of living in the United States has gone down for the middle class and the lower classes and the majority of people here? Well, that's what this video is about. And if you're a millennial or a Generation Xer or one of the other generations after the baby boomers, you didn't see how it was back then. You're just coming in now and you see how it is now and you go, hey, this is how it is. You just, maybe you accept it at face value that, housing is super expensive, medical is super expensive, college is super expensive, everything's super expensive. And you're working and you're not getting anywhere. A lot of the younger people can't even start households and start a family if they want to. It's really that bad. So why is it? Well, I've compiled my top 10 reasons that this has occurred. And there's more, but this is my top 10. This is my top 10 super ripoff list. The top 10 super ripoffs that have lowered our standard of living since the 60s and 70s. And there they are, right up there on the screen. And okay, I'm just going to go right down that list. Housing, the housing super ripoff. If you live in one of the areas that's affected by bubble real estate and bubble rents, you know all about it. And that's probably about 60% of the United States. Certainly the coastal areas, the Northeast, and many parts of the United States are hit with these super high housing prices where you've got houses costing 10 and even up to 20 times the average annual income in those areas for an average house. And that's what's lowered the standard. That lowers the standard of living right there when you've got to pay a large portion of your income for housing. Secondly, you have the medical super ripoff. Anybody who's had to go to the doctor or, God forbid, to the hospital knows that you can ring up $100,000, $200,000 for really not that big of an event. I mean, you can have an appendix attack and wind up owing $100,000 if you have to stay a couple of days in the hospital. Oh my God. So yeah, anybody knows, or if you know somebody who's gone through this, and I do, I've known quite a few people that are on like medications that cost $80,000 a year for one medication. Unbelievable. Okay, number 3 there on the list, the college super ripoff. Anybody who's going to college, if you got the millennials, the Generation Xers, you're probably, if you went to college, you're probably paying college loans because the price of college is so high that you just can't do it by, very difficult to do working your way through it like they used to do in the old days. You're going to have to borrow money. They've got loans all over the place. And of course, that's one reason the price is higher, because it's so easy to get these loans. And also the states that used to pay the large portion of the tuition for the students, they've backed off on that. And now they're asking the students to pay up and just borrow some more money, Then you can go through college. That way the state doesn't have to pay. Okay, let's go on down the list more. Number 4, the population super ripoff. The United States and the world, population has more than doubled. In the 60s, it was about 2 or 3 billion people, 2.5, 3 billion people. In the world, in the United States, it was about 180, 190 million. Well, now we've got 330 in the United States, 330 million, I think, somewhere in that area. And in the world now there's 7.5, close to 8 billion people, more than double. So more people means more demand for resources and the less stuff that's available for everybody else. In other words, The more people there is, the smaller piece of a pie every person's going to get. There's only so much to go around in the world. And that has driven down the standard of living right there too. Number 5, inflation. Oh my God. That's in everything. That is, it's intertwined in a lot of these other super ripoffs, but it is a huge super ripoff. The government is involved in driving up asset prices through their monetary policy, and they've done it. So they're, in a big part, responsible for the high housing costs that's going on right now, and a lot of the other high costs. And they create inflation. Oh, then you go down to number 6, the corporation super ripoff. Okay, why is that a ripoff? Well, corporations used to provide good jobs and good benefits here in America. Well, they've taken all those jobs and shipped them offshore, shipped their factories. I think I've heard the other day 60,000 factories have gone overseas or into Mexico, across the border. 60,000 American factories. Well, you wonder why we can't find young people can't find decent jobs with decent benefits. Okay, let's look at number 7 there on the list. The government statistics super ripoff. They're faking the statistics to make things look good. You see, unemployment is at the lowest in 50 or 60 years. Not true. They fixed the statistic to make it look like it's low. Inflation, it's so low that the Federal Reserve is trying to create more inflation. They say we don't have enough. Well, then they fixed the inflation statistic to show that inflation is low. And now they're saying there's not enough inflation. They took house prices out of the inflation calculation sometime in the early 1990s. Well, that's a big one right there. That's going to make it look like there's not inflation, even though house prices are $1 million in some areas. In some areas, average house prices are $1 million, and the average income there is $50,000. That's how screwed up the inflation calculation is. Okay, we go down to number 8, the Federal Reserve. That is a huge ripoff. They create money, they print the money, and then it gets spent into the economy. The Federal Reserve creates money from nowhere that was never worked for, nothing was ever produced for it, and they take that money and they buy things. They buy bonds, they buy loans from the bankers, and then the bankers get that money, and then they go and buy stocks. They buy real estate, they buy assets, and that drives the prices of those assets sky high. That's why the stock market and housing and most other assets are through the roof. And the Federal Reserve is responsible for that. I always say the only thing standing between a young family and a fair historical house price like their parents and grandparents got is the Federal Reserve. Okay, let's look down at number 9, the military-industrial complex super ripoff. Okay, well, they're spending $1 trillion a year on the military budget right now. That's about somewhere around 1/3 to 1/4 of the whole budget is spent on military. We're not in any wars. We're not in any kind of danger of being taken over by a foreign power or anything like that. But they're spending that money, and we're not getting anything for it. And that hurts our standard of living. When money is spent by the government, they take tax dollars in, and they spend it and we don't get anything for it, that lowers our standard of living. Okay, now to round out the top 10 super ripoff list, the number 10 is the stock market super ripoff. That stock market is being propped by the government through the Federal Reserve and other ways. And they've got the fake stock prices way up there. I think my opinion is they're about 3 to 5 times what they really should be on these indexes. And if the government wasn't in there propping them up. If they had to stand on their own, they would be 1/3 to 1/5 of the stock index values right now. So what happens? All that money is out there, 3 to 5 times its value, and these people have this money and they go spend it. So that drives up the cost of things. It drives up the cost, again, of housing. It's another impact on housing. It's another, anything. Cars, vacations, they're buying stuff with this stuff. So then that drives the demand up and the price goes up. So the stock market, money that comes from nowhere, it's really free money when they drive the price of these stocks up. Nothing is done for it. There's nothing produced. It's just money that comes into these people's hands that own these assets, stock assets. And then they go spend it. And then the money that we get from real work has to compete with that money to buy things, that fake, basically counterfeit money. And that's what's going on right now. So those are your top 10 super ripoffs. Now, I didn't go into very much detail on these. I just briefly touched on each one of the top 10 super ripoffs. But I've done a full podcast on each one of these top 10. A couple of them I did 2 podcasts on because they were so big. I had to break it into 2 podcasts to get most of the stuff I wanted to say in there. And those are really brief discussions about each of them. So if you want to watch these individual podcasts on the super ripoffs, look down there in the description section, and there is a link to each of them and a list of them there. So there they are. I mean, you can see them right there up on the screen, all 10 of them staring at you. That's what's lowered our standard of living right there. That's a big part of it. Now, there's more things, but they're smaller. These are the big ones. And that's what I'm talking about right now is the top 10 super ripoffs that lowered our standard of living. Now, most of these ripoffs started about 50 years ago, and they've been slowly building and getting larger and larger until we are where we are today. And it's really impacted people's way of life. These are the big ones. These are the ones that have really dropped our standard of living in this country. That's why you see the homeless people out there. That's why you see the guys that graduate with a college degree and they got so many loans. Maybe they got 100,000 or more in college loans and they can't find a decent job. They might end up bartending or living at home with their parents yet. You hear these stories all the time, and they're true. They're out there. Not everybody's got a bad standard of living. It is true. About 40% of Americans still have a pretty good standard of living, but the bottom 60%, they're struggling. And of course, as you go down further down that 60%, they really are having a tough time. Now, if any of these super ripoffs on this list were addressed and fixed, or even partially fixed, the middle class's standard of living would go sky high. It would start to go up and up and up, and you'd see that you'd get more for your money, you'd get more for the work you do. And like I said, your standard of living would start to improve. And certainly if they fixed all of these, we would be living, again, even greater than we were in the 1960s probably, with the productivity we have today. But unfortunately, I don't see any of these being addressed by any of the politicians, the government, who could actually do something about these. In fact, they're ratcheting down. They're making them worse. I think they're changing things for the worse, and that's why things seem to be getting worse all the time. Instead of fixing things, they're making things worse with their policy changes and so forth. So unfortunately, I don't think these are going to be improved. I don't think that they're going to fix any of these. There's too many people making too much money off the status quo, and they worked very hard to get the system like it is today so they can get that money flowing to them. And they're going to keep it that way if they can, and those are the people who are in charge. So they're not going to change it, in my opinion, not anytime soon. In fact, I would wager that if somebody listens to my podcast or another person that is thinking like me, 50, 100 years out from now, they're going to see these same 10 super ripoffs, and they might even be much, much worse than they are today. And I hope that's not the case. I hope this all does change and we go back to the great economy that we had in the 1960s and 70s, and that we make a bigger middle class, bigger and bigger than we ever had before. That's what I'm hoping, but I don't have a lot of hope for that, the way the current situation is in the country. Okay, I'm going to wrap up this podcast on the list of my top 10 super ripoffs that destroyed the American standard of living since the 1960s. These ripoffs are the main things that happened to the great standard of living we had back then, in the 60s and the 70s, really. And if you're interested in a little more detail on each of these ripoffs individually, I encourage you to go out and find the podcasts for each of those individual super ripoffs. And the links to those podcasts are in the description section below. You can find them there. Thank you for listening in today. And until next time, this is Lloyd Holiday signing off.